Well, hello everyone. Looks like we're having a nice quiet Friday afternoon. So the plan for today is to we're definitely going to finish what's left of our section on classical conditioning. So we're going to finish up with classical or Pavlovian conditioning, and then we're going to call it quits, and then we'll start nice and fresh on Monday when we'll pick up on operant conditioning. So we're going to work through sort of the rest of this content. Last time we had talked about different kinds of pairings, how we could present our CS and our US, whether they were at the same time, overlapping, separate, all of that, and what was the best way to present them together. I think we were able to finish the enhancing acquisition page before we left, yeah? I usually make a note, and then I was like, oh, I'll remember, it'll be fine. Did not remember. But I want to start by talking about another concept that's actually kind of closely related to that idea of conditioned taste aversion that we talked about briefly last time. So we had said that in any animal, there's sort of some things that we have a biological predisposition to learn. And so for us, taste aversions are one of them, where if something makes us sick, we learn it usually in a single trial, and we learn it very, very well. So we have some things that we're just set up to learn more easily. And so we can also talk about this concept of having that biological predisposition as the concept of preparedness, where we are prepared to acquire certain types of associations more easily than others. And so for this example, there's a really elegant experiment. This diagram is just the results of the experiment, so I'm going to explain the setup first. And so this was done with rats, and they had rats that were given the opportunity to drink from a water bottle, and the water bottle had a bright light behind it. It had a static generator nearby, and then the water had also been sweetened. So we could say that they had bright, noisy, and tasty water that they were drinking from. And so after the rats drank from this new water bottle, they were exposed to one of two things. So one group was exposed to shock. So there was a mild electric shock, so they would feel just a little bit of pain. And then the other group was exposed to X-rays. So they were exposed to radiation that would make them feel nauseous. And so the question for this experiment was, which of the qualities of the water would they associate with those particular stimuli? So which would they think had caused them to feel pain or to feel sick? And so when we took those rats afterwards, after they had been sort of exposed to this, and it's one trial learning, they only had to be exposed to this once, and then they were given the choice. Do they drink from a tube that has bright, noisy water, so it has light and the static, or do they drink from a tube that doesn't have light or static, but has sweet-tasting water? And so the idea would be they drink more from the one that they trust, and they'd avoid the one that they were sort of scared of because of what they had experienced. And so in that first group that had experienced the shock, we see that they had a lot less time spent with that bright, noisy water tube. So they spent more time with the sweet water, the tasty water, and they avoided the bright, noisy water. So they associated something that caused them physical pain with something that they could see and hear. But the X-ray group, the ones that got sick, they did the opposite. They spent more time at the bright, noisy water, and they avoided the sweet or the tasty water. So they attributed being sick to something that they could taste, and they didn't associate it with something that they could see and hear. So that kind of makes sense. Things that make us sick usually come from us having eaten something. That's a pretty safe assumption. And then things that hurt us, we would identify hazards in our environment by sight and hearing. So it makes sense to associate those as well. So this is just a really nice, clean example where you get to see, if you give them all of these different stimuli at once, which one do they make that association with? And it depends on the kind of unconditioned stimulus you use in the process. So there's lots of cool experiments like this. I get to talk about this one in my sort of upper level learning course, and a couple of others which are fun. Okay, So with that sort of mild detour, we can now start on our next concept, which is, okay, we've acquired these associations, we've learned to link these two different stimuli. Well, what now? So now we're going to look at the process of extinction. And this is the process where we have our conditioned stimulus and we present it in the absence of our unconditioned stimulus. So if we go back to our example of ringing a bell and giving a dog food, and then eventually the dog will salivate when they hear the bell. If you ring that bell over and over and over again, but you stop giving them food, then they're going to lose that association between the food and the bell. So we lose that link between our conditioned and unconditioned stimuli. And so this causes our conditioned response to weaken and then eventually disappear. So over time, the dog will salivate less and less, and eventually they won't salivate at all. They'll just ignore the bell and go about their lives. And so if we wanted a visual for this process, we have this nice clean graph here. So across the bottom, we have time. That's a pretty straightforward one. And then on the y-axis, we have strength of our conditioned response. So this is sort of arbitrary because it can apply to any situation. If we're using our dog salivating example, then that conditioned response would be how much saliva are they producing. So it might be in milliliters or something like that. If you were looking at a startle response, maybe you could quantify how violent of a reaction they have or something like that. So lower down means less responding, higher up means more of a response. So lower saliva production, higher. And so we see at the beginning we have our acquisition curve, and that's a nice clean line. So we have our conditioned stimulus and our unconditioned stimulus presented together, and we see that they learn to associate them. We get this measure by doing those trials, those test trials where you'd ring the bell without giving them food and see how much they salivated. And then eventually you kind of peak at the top where when you ring the bell, they produce a lot of saliva. And then where that white line is, that's where we switch from our acquisition phase, from that learning phase, over to extinction. So now we present our conditioned stimulus alone, no more food, just ringing the bell. And at first, the dog is used to getting food when they hear that bell. So they're still going to salivate for a while. But again, if you keep ringing the bell and they're not getting food, they're going to stop associating that sound with food. They stop salivating. So a pretty steep drop off, and eventually we see that they no longer salivate in response to the bell. And then we get a neat phenomenon that tends to occur when we're doing extinction. So in this process of extinction, once you've gone through that process, once you've extinguished that particular response, we tend to see something called spontaneous recovery. And this is when our apparently extinct conditioned response will reappear if we present that conditioned stimulus again after we took a break. So if we went through extinction and then we went home for the night, or we went to bed and then we rang the bell again the next morning, we would see spontaneous recovery. And it's usually a somewhat weaker version of that conditioned response. And so again, what does that look like? So if that blue stripe is our pause, maybe we took a day off, maybe we just stopped for the day and started up again the next morning. For whatever reason, when we have that break, right afterwards, if we ring the bell, the dog will salivate again. Not as much as after they had been conditioned to salivate, but enough, something that we could measure or quantify. So we would call that reoccurrence of that conditioned response would be spontaneous recovery. If we continued to present the conditioned stimulus without our unconditioned stimulus, they would very quickly stop responding to it. They would stop salivating a lot faster. And then if we had another break, they would probably have spontaneous recovery again the next day, but it would be even less intense than the spontaneous recovery the first day. So you'd see sort of this gradual tapering off until they no longer respond. It's probably well beyond what you need to know for this course, but I find it interesting, and again, this is my specialty. So when you're learning through extinction, it's not that you're unlearning what you learned in acquisition. Extinction is a separate process where you learn something that interferes with the acquisition. So what's happening with spontaneous recovery is you're relying on the thing that you learned first, because you don't lose that acquired association, you just learn something else that ends up superseding it. And so when you take that break, you tend to go back to your originally learned association. I just always found it interesting that it's not an unlearning process, it's a new learning process that you stack on top, which is kind of cool. All right, so our next concept is the idea of conditioned inhibition or safety signals. And so far we've been talking about something that could fall under the category of just a conditioned exciter. A conditioned exciter is just a conditioned stimulus that ends up producing a conditioned response. So with our visual example, we're going to have, if you're exposed to a blue square and a gray star, and every time you're exposed to that blue square and gray star, you're going to have a puff of air sort of blown at your face. This is a really common psychological setup because we have a natural eye blink reflex where any time that air sort of comes at us quickly, we'll sort of flinch back and blink, which you would have known if you've gone to, say, an eye doctor and they do that glaucoma test. It's awful. So they would use this, they'd show you these images, and anytime you see the square and star, puff of air. And eventually, anytime you see the square and star, you might flinch just because of the association that you've learned. So those have become a conditioned stimulus. And specifically, we're going to call that blue square a conditioned exciter because it ends up telling us something about what's happening when we see the star. And so I will explain a little bit more about that when we introduce our triangle at the bottom. Oops, wrong way. So we can also have, instead of something that says you are going to get a puff of air, we can also have something that says you are not going to get a puff of air. And this is our safety signal or a conditioned inhibitor. So exciter would be that it's going to happen. The inhibitor is it's not going to happen. And so our safety signal is basically a conditioned stimulus that tells us that an unconditioned stimulus is not coming. So it's telling us that we are safe for the time being. And so if we go back to this, so we still have our star, but if we have a triangle with that star, then we never get a puff of air. And so then we would learn that if there's the blue square, the air will happen, and if there's the triangle, the air will not happen. So they're kind of like modifiers that tell us something about what the star means. So sometimes when we see the star, if it's accompanied by the blue square, then we will get a puff of air and we should flinch. And if it's accompanied by a triangle, then it won't be accompanied by a puff of air and we shouldn't flinch. So we have signals like these inhibitors that let us know sort of when something applies or not. An actually really good example to try and figure out what's going on here is think of, say you have a construction in your neighborhood, which happens always in my neighborhood. And there's a set of lights. So you have traffic lights outside, but they're doing construction in that intersection. And so there's a police officer in the intersection who's guiding traffic. So usually you would attend to the lights. You would pay attention to the lights. They tell you when to go or when to stop. But when the police officer is there, they're saying that the lights no longer matter. So they're conditionally modifying what the lights mean to us. So they would tell us that usually the lights say go or stop. Now they're not giving you anything. Listen to me instead. So that's kind of what the triangle and the square are doing, is telling us when something will be accompanied by a thing or not. And of course we can get a lot more complicated in the steps that are going on here, but I think we'll keep it at that one. The next two concepts I want to talk about are almost like opposite sides of the same concept. And this is the idea of generalization and discrimination. Stimulus generalization and discrimination doesn't just apply to classical conditioning. we're going to talk about it in terms of classical conditioning, but then we are also going to use it when we talk about operant conditioning as well. So this is something that works with a lot of different things. So some of our examples will be a little bit more operant than classical, but that's okay. But the concept here is that with stimulus generalization, we have a process where once we've established our conditioned stimulus, once that conditioned stimulus reliably produces a conditioned response, we might find that similar stimuli might also produce a conditioned response. So if you have a bell, and when you ring that bell, your dog salivates because it assumes it's getting food, what if your sibling has another bell? It's slightly smaller, so it's higher pitched, but it's also a bell. If your sibling rings the bell and the dog salivates too, even though it's a different bell, it's a different frequency, we would say that the dog has generalized by responding to that second stimulus as well. So they're responding to something that was different than the original conditioned stimulus. They're responding to something other than what they were trained on. So we could say that they generalize that response to other closely related stimuli. And so if we wanted to look at a visual of that again, we have this nice diagram here. Along the bottom, we have lines of differing orientations. And then on our y-axis, we have again that strength of conditioned response. So higher on that axis just means more responding. And so from looking at this, we see that, okay, so we have the most responding to that vertical line. So that would be that something has been trained for a particular response to that vertical line. That's our conditioned stimulus. So I usually see these and think of pigeons pecking, where you can teach them to peck to vertical lines and sort of not to horizontal lines, and you see how much they respond to sort of slight angles. But that's an operant conditioning setup. So this would be more of maybe when there's a vertical line, you get a puff of air in the face, and when there's a horizontal line, you don't, and we're quantifying how quickly you flinch. So if the line is a little bit horizontal or sort of on a diagonal, but it's close to vertical, do you still flinch or not? And if you still flinch, even though it's not exactly perfectly vertical, we could say that you generalized your response. You're treating that slightly different stimulus the same as you did the original conditioned stimulus, because you're eliciting a conditioned response to something else. We can have then the exact opposite of that. So, okay, what about, oh, I changed the title, but not the words. Interesting. Okay. That is supposed to say stimulus discrimination at the top, and then also in the definition. The definition's correct. It's different from the other one. It's just I didn't switch the one word out. So cross that out, and I'll make a note to change that later. But so our stimulus discrimination is the process where we focus on the fact that you have a less pronounced conditioned response to stimuli that differ from that original conditioned stimulus. So this is when we see that we have a difference in responding. So we'll have a conditioned response occur to one stimulus, the trained original conditioned stimulus, and we won't see as much responding to other things. So if we looked at, again, same basic setup, but now we're seeing more discrimination than generalization. So here the person would flinch at a vertical line, but as soon as it's slightly off the vertical, they stop reacting. So they show much less of that conditioned response as soon as we deviate from what they were originally trained on. And so if we wanted to sort of use this terminology a little bit more, we would say that, okay, so if the person flinches at both vertical and diagonal lines, then they generalized that fear response to the other types of stimulus. If we say that they flinch to the vertical line, but they don't flinch to the diagonal line, then we could say that they discriminated between those two line orientations. And that ability to discriminate between different stimuli is actually what a lot of my research is based on, is the ability to sort of treat different types of stimuli or different categories of stimuli separately. And we use this discrimination setup with our chickadees to see if they can react to one type of stimulus but not to another. So we ask the question, can they discriminate between this stimulus and that stimulus? And so usually you do that by training them to one and seeing if they respond to another. So with this discrimination versus generalization, if we focus on the fact that they're behaving similarly to other things, that's when it's generalization. And if we focus on the fact that they're behaving differently to different things, then it's discrimination. And there's usually an example that asks you about this whenever I make a test. All right, next is the promised topic of higher order conditioning. This is also going to be a very nice quick review of plain old classical conditioning because we need normal conditioning to lead to higher order conditioning. But if we want our definition, higher order conditioning is a procedure where an already conditioned stimulus gets paired with a new neutral stimulus. So that neutral stimulus will become a conditioned stimulus and elicit a conditioned response. So this is when we would use, okay, so we have our bell and we have, actually, I have the example here. We have visuals to go with that. So this was the same one where instead of the bell, they used a tone. Same difference, auditory cue. Before conditioning, a tone doesn't mean anything to a dog, so it's a neutral stimulus. Our unconditioned stimulus is food because when you give a dog food, they're going to salivate. So salivation is an unconditioned response. Then during conditioning, you present both together, the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus at the same time, and the dog is going to salivate because they're getting that unconditioned stimulus. So we get an unconditioned response. And after conditioning, if we present the tone or the conditioned stimulus all on its own, then we get a conditioned response. So the dog has learned something about that previously neutral stimulus, and now it is a conditioned stimulus. So that's plain old classical conditioning. That is also step one of higher order conditioning. So we start now with this conditioned stimulus, something that we've learned something about, and now we're going to move on to our second step. So this would be second order conditioning because we have another second step afterwards. And so here, before we go into our higher order conditioning, if we played that tone, the dog would salivate. They'd produce that conditioned response because we trained them in the last step. We also are introducing a new neutral stimulus. So here a black square. So we're moving away from our auditory cues. We're using a visual cue. And a black square means nothing to a dog. So there's no response. It's a neutral stimulus. During higher order conditioning, this would be our second acquisition phase, we would pair our neutral stimulus, the black square, with our conditioned stimulus from the first step. So we would call this our first conditioned stimulus, or CS1, and that's just showing that it's the first one that we had trained. And during this acquisition phase here, the dog would be salivating and it would be called a conditioned response because they're not salivating to an unconditioned stimulus. We're not using food anymore. We don't have to because the dog already knows something about that tone, so we're making use of an existing relationship. And then after that second acquisition phase, we could then present the dog with the black square and they should salivate. So they're going to produce a conditioned response, which means that that black square is our new conditioned stimulus. So we can call it our CS2 or our second conditioned stimulus. So we can chain things together in order to have the same response to different things. And the cool part here is that we were able to condition this particular response, we got them to salivate without ever bringing food into the training process. After that first step has been accomplished, our second order or the higher order conditioning step here doesn't require that original enforcer. So we don't need the food anymore. And this higher order conditioning process is, we see it in a lot of things. Most of the associations that we learn in the real world through like conditioning would be higher order conditioning, because it's very rare that things will directly give us something like food or even startling us. So most of the things that we learn are through sort of secondary associations. And my big example for this is advertising. So I always talk about how, say, a beer company would use the fact that you already have a conditioned response to seeing a bunch of attractive people at a party. You've learned that attractive people at a party, that's something that you would like to do, that makes you feel good. So that already is something you've learned about. And then if in their commercials they have their beer with attractive people at a party, you then associate their product with people that make you feel good. And so it's sort of piggybacking on things that you've already learned. So most types of advertising will do this, where they latch on to something that already makes you feel a particular way and make you feel the same way about their product. So it's not just like attractive people and alcohol. You could even look at something like if they want to make you feel sympathy, they will show you pictures of children and then ask you for money. Or they will want you to feel welcome and at home, and they might show you sort of family dinners, things that people tend to already associate with feeling a particular way. So there's lots of different ways that we can use this higher order conditioning. And this is only sort of second order. We've only gone 2 steps removed, but you can stack them and have multiple steps, which is really cool. All right, and then for the last bit here, we're going to start talking a little bit about fears and phobias, how we acquire some of our fears, and then how we might get rid of them as well. And of course, you can't talk about fear in psychology, especially when it comes to learning about fears, without mentioning little Albert. So this is one of those case studies that always comes up in psychology. This is the equivalent of talking about HM when you're studying memory, or I can't remember the other one, which is awful, who was about personality. But the same way where those ones would be just initials to protect their identity, this child was called Little Albert to protect his identity, which actually has led us to be unsure of who Little Albert actually was. And there's some debate on who he was and how this process affected him, but we'll get to that in the end. So you might remember that we had talked about John B. Watson as being credited with establishing the school of behaviorism. And so our behaviorists are focused on our environmental influence on our behavior. So Watson was famous for saying that as long as he could control the environment entirely, he said you could give him any child, and he could use that control of the environment to turn them into anything they wanted. Could make them a doctor, a carpenter, a criminal, anything, by controlling the environment. And so his research was focused on how our experience with our environment could affect our behavior. And in this particular case, he worked with a young child, the Little Albert from the title, and he exposed Little Albert to a white rat. And when he started, he was about 9 months old. He had no preconceived notions about rats, so he would see a rat and he didn't really react. It was a neutral stimulus. But over time, he conditioned a fear response to that rat. So anytime Little Albert was touching the rat, Watson would bang a gong in the background, a really loud, sudden sound, and it would startle him and make him cry. And so anytime the rat was out, if Little Albert interacted with it, loud sound, crying. And so eventually, anytime he saw the rat, let alone touched it, he would start crying. So it was a conditioned fear response to that rat. And then we got to see generalization, where Little Albert would actually have a fear response to things that were also white and furry, like the rat was. So a fur coat would elicit that same fear response, so he would start crying. Little Albert did show some discrimination, though. There were certain things that he didn't cry to. I think they said that there was a Santa suit that he didn't react to, so maybe the presence of red was enough to tell him it was okay. But he showed both generalization and discrimination in this case. And then the part where we get to the mystery is after this had gone on for a while, the little Albert's mother stopped bringing him to the sessions before they were able to sort of remove this learned fear, and nobody really knew what happened to them. So there's a bunch of sort of rumors of who it is and who little Albert grew up to be. Some of them say that he lived a very short and miserable life. Other people say that they for sure know who he is and he lived a full life and he didn't love pets when he was older, but it didn't negatively impact his life. So it's kind of an interesting mystery, and every time someone's sure that they've got the right answer, somebody else raises some questions about it. But that's a little random tidbit of weird psychology info there. We can also talk about sort of getting rid of fears, which they weren't able to do with little Albert after inducing a fear. But we can talk about a phobia. So phobias are extreme and irrational fears directed at, say, people or objects or situations. So if someone is agoraphobic, they don't like open spaces. Or if they're acrophobic, they're afraid of space. And I keep forgetting the one for spiders. Arachnophobic, that should be the easiest one. Colorophobic, afraid of clowns. There's a whole list of them. So people have lots and lots of possible phobias that they might have. And again, we have that biological predisposition or preparedness to acquire some fears and phobias. So for example, things like snakes and spiders tend to make us afraid a lot easier than something like flowers. So when you're doing conditioning and you try and get people to flinch or scare them when they're shown pictures, it's easier to condition a fear response to spiders and snakes than it is to flowers. So more of that predispositional stuff. But when someone has a phobia, it can interfere with their lives. So it can cause anxiety and panic and lead them to avoid particular activities. So of course, people are going to try and help them through this. And the topic of doing that we're going to talk about is called systematic desensitization or exposure therapy. And if you continue on into 105, they spend a lot more time on different kinds of treatments for different disorders. There's a whole chapter on it. But this one is directly based on Pavlovian conditioning and uses the exact same concept to overcome it. So we mentioned this one here just very briefly, but if this is something you're interested in, there's a lot more to come. But with this systematic desensitization, we use the idea of extinction, where we would think of, okay, so someone's afraid of snakes. So we would show them a picture of a snake, the conditioned stimulus, the thing that they would have a fear response to, but we show it to them in a safe environment where there is no unconditioned stimulus, where there is no unconditioned response. So, or hopefully there wouldn't be an unconditioned response. So we're trying to get them to see the snake without being bit by the snake or touched by the snake. So if they see it and realize that nothing has happened, hopefully their fear response over time, that conditioned response, would lessen. So we use this extinction process or desensitization process to produce less of a response when they're exposed to it in absence of anything bad happening. Mm-hmm.
I've seen like things, so like I don't know if this would be or if it would be kind of the opposite, but since these like you're supposed to feel safe to reduce the fear, like they wouldn't give you conditioned stimuli. So what about people who like face their fears and then they get over it? Because like you're putting yourself in, I guess, your situation of danger. So would that be the same thing, or would it be a different?
It's slightly different. So I know this simply because I teach 105. But that's a process called flooding, which is basically where you go to the extreme. So instead of like systematic desensitization, it's like you would start with, you'd have like a cartoon of a snake and you'd be on the other side of the room and you'd slowly get closer and then you'd like a more realistic picture and then eventually you'd have like a real snake and maybe someday you could hold it. But flooding is like they throw you in at the deep end and they'd put you in a box filled with snakes and say, figure it out. And the reason why it's a very controversial approach is because more often than not, it actually makes the fear worse, because people will run away from that experience and they end up, because they've left a scary situation, they've gotten away from something that was bad, that's reinforcing. So by leaving that situation, they feel better, and then they're more likely to avoid it in the future. So flooding is very unfavored nowadays. But if you can stick it out, and if you can sit there and sort of force yourself to be in it and realize that you're still okay, then it can be helpful. So it's only really used in situations where either you don't have the time to do the systematic desensitization, or it's something that you can't have like different levels of. So if you're afraid to leave your house, there's no in between from leaving your house and not leaving your house. So you'd kind of have to go with flooding, even if it is more extreme. But yeah, those are the sort of two distinctions. But yeah, that was what I wanted to cover for our classical conditioning. So next time we pick up fresh on Monday. Oh, actually, you have a question.
Yeah, would they use flooding in shows like The Fear Factor?
If their intention is to get people over a fear, then yes. Usually shows like that, I don't think they're necessarily helping. That's, yeah. And yeah, the learning side of things, it's not usually a good process. Yeah. But yeah, so we'll do operant conditioning on Monday, and then we'll probably be doing our social learning on Wednesday, and then if we have time, I'll do sort of a review of operant conditioning with chickadee examples on Friday, so that we don't have any new content, and then we can be prepped for the midterm on the following Monday.
Is our midterm going to be the same like kind of format?
It's going to be the same format, but it's in person now, so it's on paper. So it'll be the same, some short answer questions and some multiple choice questions, but on paper. Mm-hmm.
How many questions are you going to
I haven't decided yet. So I'm trying to work out the specifics of it. Usually with a physical test, I go with slightly fewer than what I do online, because I'm less concerned about people being able to Google everything. You still have access to your notes, and that's fine. But I'll probably do something like, I think it was like 40 and 5. So I'll probably do like 35 and 5. That's usually how I do it.
Do you have